Welcome to Routing for Success, the show where we interview today's top logistics professionals, giving them a platform to share their stories and best practices. Today we are talking with Steve Ramsthel. Steve began as an independent service provider for FedEx Ground after retiring from a successful corporate career, which included senior executive positions with Allstate and AAA, where he served as Chief Operations Officer. Steve's professional background lends him a unique perspective on the parcel delivery business. In addition to operating 2 CSAs of his own, Steve uses his analytical skill set to help fellow service providers to optimize their business operations. In this episode, we discuss cash flow, profit and loss metrics, contract negotiations, and Steve's unique strategy around the alternative vehicle program. Without further delay, I give you Steve Ramsthel. All right, Steve, thanks for meeting with us today.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
So before we dive into the content, why don't you tell us a little bit about your professional background? What were you doing before you ever heard of FedEx Ground package delivery?
Yeah, so my background is probably very different than the average FedEx contractor. I mean, I spent, north of 26 years in corporate America, kind of came up the ranks starting in Portland, Oregon. Started kind of in a sales position, actually, with a financial services company, worked up their management ranks. And as you know, back in those days, we got moved once you get into management about every 2.5 years. So I moved from Portland to Seattle to Chicago, actually to Phoenix, and then all the way out to Detroit and then back to Phoenix. It was in senior executive positions in a financial services company. Ran operations for, actually, I was a chief operating officer for AAA out of the Michigan area, actually out of the Dearborn, Michigan area. And I just worked across the street, actually, from the Ford headquarters. And then did mergers and acquisitions for Bank of America back in the really rough days around 2008 when the narrative was too big to fail. So we were doing a lot of deduplication of people, process, and technology in what we would call the toxic assets that were going on in the banking business. And then I ended up through an acquisition running a spinoff company from Bank of America for Bank of America, and then was acquired by an Australian company at the time. So it was a good corporate run, but what I ended up doing is move about 6 times with my family. And then I got to the place where I retired early from corporate and wanted to do something. And so randomly, I got into the FedEx business, and how I got there was the fact that I was looking at biz, buy, sell, like probably a lot of people here, and kept on running into FedEx routes. I looked at, owning a restaurant. I looked at car washes, insurance agency, all kinds of different opportunities out there. And what was attractive about FedEx was, one, the brand, and the fact that I really believed in e-commerce. And there's really only 2 ways to do e-commerce is logistics and software, which I've done both of those. And, you didn't have any marketing, you don't have any sales, and you don't have any accounts receivable. So, being in last mile delivery and FedEx, the brand, and now all you get to focus on is operational excellence. So it became attractive. And that was back in the day. It was pre-ISP, and Phoenix, or in the Arizona area, which I live now, was one of the last parts of the country to actually convert to the ISP program. So, I wasn't really that comfortable with the contract prior to ISP, which is the independent service provider contractor contracting agreement. So I searched out, and I ended up buying an ISP agreement out of just south of Portland, Oregon, in Salem, Oregon, back in actually it was the fall of 2016. So, and I grew up there, so it was a natural fit. So that's kind of how I got into the FedEx business. And then from there, we started doing a consulting business around ISP negotiations. One thing led to another. After building trusted relationship with FedEx contractors across the country, we also broke out into a brokerage business and consulting business and obviously negotiations. And then I've expanded into another CSA now out of the West Portland area. So I'm trying to not be overly verbose here, but that's kind of the flight path, if you will, into the FedEx world from our perspective.
Well, thanks for the background. And, one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast in general is because the set of people who run these businesses is extremely diverse. And actually, the first few podcast episodes that we've recorded, they've been people who started with RPS. Back in, I just finished an interview where he started with RPS in 1989, and he ran one truck for like a decade before finally moving up. And then we've got people like you kind of on the other end of the spectrum where you had a successful corporate background, you were doing mergers and acquisitions, and you decided to get into this after a very successful career. And it's a different skill set that you bring to the table and a different perspective on things. So I've been looking forward to this conversation for sure. So we want to talk today about the topics of improving cash flow, negotiations with FedEx, and then leveraging something that's relatively new, which is the alternative vehicle program. And Steve, obviously you have a lot to offer in these areas. I feel like this is probably going to be an episode where I don't do much talking, and I think that's totally fine. I think that people tuning in, they want content and advice that's going to help them, that people can go out, get the gears turning, and maybe have something that they can then apply to their own business. I think that's the most important piece of this entire podcast project, is that people have something to take away from it. So why don't we dive in? Let's dive into the content, really wherever you want to start.
All right. Well, let's talk about the financials, because this is, at the end of the day, it is a financial model. And if you're not running your business by the numbers, then the business is really going to run you. And so this is a numbers game. And when I say that, is that it's really important to understand what is your top line revenue, which, we get that. We get the 1099, we get the weekly settlement statements, we get all that kind of stuff like that. What people really understand in this business, if you're not a numbers person, or if you're a legacy contractor that came in to deliver packages, and then when you wake up one day and you've got 20 trucks and 30 employees and all of the moving parts that go along there, is what is your cost to operate? And I've built tools. I'm kind of a nerdy kind of a person, but I'm always wanting to understand what my cost to operate is. And in this business, it's going to be trucks, it's going to be people, but those trucks and the cost of operating those trucks and people is going to be dependent really on miles per day per driver and stops per day per driver. And once we can figure that out, and with the geographical fit of that, and some CSAs are not very dense and some are very dense, but it really is getting down into those stops per day per driver. In other words, the dispatch is going to drive the total number of resources. And of course, along with that comes taxes and all the other things that go along there. So I'm a firm believer that if you understand your profit and loss statement and the ratios in each one of those and what drives those, in other words, the number of people you're dispatching every day is going to drive your overall income or loss. And, in this business, if you're not doing a 15%, 18%, I would say, somewhere the target range would be north of 15 up to about a 24% EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization. If you're not, and I think EBITDAs over this last year, over 2022 are lower, driven primarily by the cost of fuel has gone crazy, and wages too. But if you, in this business, because there's so much capital expenditures, I would call that CapEx, which is basically debt service over and above, which would be called buying trucks, that you've got to have your EBITDAs north of 15 or 18% to have a sustainable business over a long period of time. So you really have to be a numbers person. And if you're not a numbers person, either try to learn the numbers or get somebody that understands, payroll every week. So one of the things running it by the numbers is super important. and just do back of the envelope math. If you, in today's world, if you have the opportunities to consolidate or integrate, or we'll just call it, do one less dispatch on average per day, that it's about at least $85,000, because you're going to pay somebody close to $1,000 a week. You're going to pay payroll taxes, workers' comp, unemployment insurance, all that. That's going to run you probably close to 20% before benefits. Then you're going to run that truck. You're going to pay insurance. You're going to pay the gas, fuels, repairs, maintenance, all of that. So if you're running just one route more than you really should, it's about 85 grand, right? So I look at some of these people, and I'll go in and look at the weekly service worksheets or work area planning information, and they'll be running, a couple, too heavy. And I understand that, this last year we all probably kind of did that because we didn't know what the volumes are going to be, but 2 extra trucks and people that you run, that you probably shouldn't be running, is going to cost you, $170,000 or $80,000 a year. And generally that stuff goes to the bottom line. So that's how powerful the numbers can be. All CSAs are not the same. I'm not saying that you can do that across the board, but you really got to be all over the dispatch. And that's kind of an art and a science together. But at the end of the day, since we don't have marketing, we don't have sales, we don't count accounts receivable, we have to double down and be really good around operational excellence. So that's a really important thing. And there's a lot more to just the dispatch. I mean, it's about buying your fuel right. It's about, putting the right driver in the right seat on the right route. I mean, we can do a whole series of podcasts around that, getting the right truck, right? Whether you buy diesel, whether you buy gas. I'm not sure if the EV thing's going to work out. It doesn't cash flow for me, right? When you look at the cost of those trucks just yet. Now, maybe with time it will. I like EVs. I've got a couple myself. I own a couple of Teslas, and I know that like repairs and maintenance are like nothing. But if we can get those trucks for under $100,000, then that might cash flow well. But right now they're not. But what I'm saying is you've got to analyze everything, new, used, all that stuff, to make it work in your cash flow model. But at the end of the day, and I'll say this one more time, is that if you're not getting an EBITDA, in other words, free cash flow above, at least at 15% or above of revenue, there's no point in being in this business, because there's just so many bills. You're going to have debt service, you're going to buy trucks, and you got to pay yourself something, So I look at it and say, you got to pay all your bills, you got to do your debt service, and you got to pay yourself at least an 8 to 9%, maybe 10% return on revenue to make this thing interesting across the board. So that's probably, for now, I kept that pretty high level from a financial perspective, but it would be really good that people understand profit and loss statements or income statements, and then how to normalize those statements and understand what your free cash flow actually is.
Yeah, I mean, that's from a high level, that's what the game is all about. So Steve, I'm going to make a statement, and I want you to tell me whether I'm right or wrong, or to what degree. And the statement is that in the range of FedEx service providers, there's some distribution where on one end, you have the people who are the operations that are super efficient and they're making a lot of money. And then on the other end, you have the operations that aren't running very efficient. And there's probably most of the people fall in the middle somewhere. There's some distribution. 2022, I've had a lot of contractors tell me was a particularly tough year because the cost of everything went up: fuel, other consumables, labor, trucks. And what that effectively did is it just took the entire distribution, if you were to look at it on a graph, and move it to the left. And we're hearing a lot of noise from some sections of the service provider network saying, I can't run a profitable business. I'm not cash flowing. So here's the statement. Are those service providers that just aren't running efficiently enough? Is it within their control? Is that kind of the lesson here with you talking about you got to know the numbers, you need to understand the P&L, and how to run efficiently, or is there more to the story than that?
So I think there's a lot more to the story than that. To be completely honest with you, I mean, I talk to, I probably work with at least 400 different ISPs a year, doing their end of agreement negotiation or renegotiation or negotiating for an open CSA. Depending, and I look at their P&Ls, we look at their weekly service worksheets, we look at all of that. And I would say that, there's definitely room for improvement for all of us, including myself and my two CSAs, that you can be more operationally efficient. I think that we can all do that. And I think the number one way, I think the biggest challenge for contractors today is that they know a lot about the business in terms of logistics and dispatch, but the number one skill set that you really have to have is human resources. I mean, if I were to say that if you can't effectively recruit somebody and then retain them, then nothing else matters. You're not going to dispatch. The trucks aren't going to matter. Your financials aren't going to matter. And that's the number one reason why people are failing. And so you got to get really comfortable with being in the selling game, the recruiting game all of the time. And then you also you can never let your people hold you hostage for wages. And this sounds really horrible, but I think it's true, is that the FedEx does not give us enough money to look and feel like the progression of pay that you're going to see with drivers at UPS. We're a low cost model. And the way I've been very successful over the last 8 years in this business is realize that one, I'm managing the key performance metrics, right? Which is safety and service. I won't go through all that, but all of those, but you have to manage those. And I know that, for example, if I want to make an 18% EBITDA in my Salem operation, that I've got to average about 138 stops per day per driver. Okay. But I also realize that people are going to come and people are going to go. And at the driver level, that's going to happen. You have to be prepared for that and have the stomach for that. What you need to do to make and keep your organization bulletproof is really good people at the top of the organization. In other words, your BCs or operations managers. Recruit those people, pay them well, take really good care of them, make sure that there's loyalty, there's trust, there's good culture, and that will generally trickle downhill. But if you don't have a good, solid, steady Eddie BC in that job, then you're just going to be chasing your tail for forever. So you got to figure that at the top. The other thing too is that I would say then in some cases, and I know this will fly in the face of FedEx, is that there is not appropriate ISP charges. In other words, the rates in which they pay us that are good for everybody. And there has been what I would call field, first and last mile, engineering irregularities, if you will, from one ISP to the next that just don't make sense whatsoever. And I can tell you, when you dive deep into them and you look at your cost to operate, I can sniff those out pretty quickly. And those are opportunities for renegotiation, which we do. And that's a complicated process that is not about just turning in receipts and saying, oh, by the way, I get unique characteristics and all that. But we have a tool that we've built where we do, through a cost to operate, we do a forecasted income statement. And more importantly is we actually complete the exchange of information workbook for you that you can submit to first and last mile in their language, which is what does it cost to dispatch. But if you don't go through that work, you're never going to get a better rate. And if you do that 100% of the time, that doesn't guarantee 100% success. But I would tell you that yes, there's an opportunity to improve from an efficiency perspective. I think in some cases, we're getting a lower rate than we should to operate the business in a sustainable way, for sure. And I also think that there are unique characteristics that have not been fully identified and that are in the system. There's no question about that. That could be a missing component. But all of those things have to line up if we're going to have a sustainable business. And frankly, I've done enough negotiations over the last couple of years. I'm disappointed that regardless of having unique characteristics or not, that FedEx has not come out with kind of across the board adjustments for inflation, because our fuel is not 100% protected. So when you look at the fuel surcharge, on a per stop basis, it was built to hedge at a 100% level every single a penny or dime in that actual charge, which it does. The only problem is it doesn't cover 100% of your fuel spend. So when you go back and look at what really happened in 2022 is we had about a 30% hedge on the fuel burn. And when gas went up insane levels, call it 200%, 70% of that increase in fuel was borne on us, a small business person, and 30% was borne by the company. The unfortunate thing is most of the people we work with in the field, the senior managers, P&D managers, and even some of the negotiators don't really understand that component and how we're exposed. So, you have to understand all those moving parts, but I think it's complicated. There is not a one yes or no answer. I think there's opportunities for FedEx to move in the right direction from a reimbursement perspective, from an ISP charges. There's an opportunity for us as contractors to leverage, best in class technology, the metrics, all of that kind of stuff, and to achieve your desired outcome. I've never actually delivered a package in my life, and I'm in a FedEx terminal probably every other week up in Oregon. And I know the business really well. Like I know all 21 FedEx negotiators. I know this like the back of my hand. It's just that my skill set isn't delivering packages, but I know what the required outcome is to have a successful business. I believe in the FedEx culture, if you as an authorized officer immerse yourself in too many tasks and you become the jack of all trades and are working in the business instead of on the business, then you literally can lose the business. And I say that is because there's so much fatigue when you have a 7-day operation and you've got to do all the things that FedEx wants you to do. If you're doing DRO and you're taking CPC calls and all of that stuff, you will literally hit a point where you'll just want to give up. And I don't think when people get fatigue, right? I would say, and I've done some reading around human psychology. I had this one psychologist say, you need to understand what the acronym of HALT is. It's HALT, right? If you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, you're not going to perform well, right? It's halt, step back from the business, right? Step back from the relationship, whatever it may be, right? And reassess. But I see a lot of, authorized officers and people that are so overly immersed in the business, they don't know, they're chasing their tail, and there's not any current corrective action. And before you know it, in this business, you have a couple bad weeks of, DNAs and accidents, and then it leads to an OTC, an opportunity to cure. And before you know it, you've lost your first rights and everything. It's like a house of cards. So you got to be really, really careful. And in this business, as we all know, we're heavily involved or invested in the capital, right, of the acquisition of the business, and also with the trucks and everything else that goes with it. So, you got to be really careful, because if we don't run it the way it should be ran, it can negatively impact your, finances, and obviously, finances can, then the stress of that can impact, your personal life and your other relationships in your life. So long-winded answer, but, hard to just say yes, no, or it's one or two things. It's a multitude of things, to be successful.
Well, there are some nuggets in there for sure. If anything, I'll come away with a new acronym to use: HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. You're not going to perform. But also, another thing you said that stood out to me was you got to be in a position to work on the business instead of working in the business.
Mm-hmm.
And from personal experience, I ran a company where we had a network of equipment dealerships, had nothing to do with FedEx. I experienced that firsthand. When I first got into it, I was working super hard in the business. And I remember one day I woke up and I thought to myself, why is it that my email inbox is jammed full with all of my employees telling me things that I need to do? I'm being totally reactive to this business, and I am so far in the weeds, I can't see what's going on. I don't have that elevated view. And that can be tough for people to make that transition for sure, but that's an important distinction to make. You got to be working on the business instead of in it. So we're talking about improving cash flow. Steve, you had mentioned that there's some KPIs or key performance metrics that you look at with regards to the P&L, and we're not going to go over all of them or many of them, but could you give us like one or two? If you were to look at just look at a random P&L from an ISP today, what are the first one or two things that you would look for as potential spots where a lot of people are just missing the mark and it's having a big negative impact on their business?
So payroll as a percentage of revenue is an indicator. And, it's not, when you look at ISP revenue, it's all over the place in terms of, we'll call it dollars per stop, if you will, because there's 10 ISP charges. But if you want to simplify it and say, well, what's my total forecasted, we'll call it PCAT revenue divided by total number of stops, you're going to come up with a number, right? And so, if you have an ISP with a lot of miles, and I've negotiated deals where we're doing $11 a stop, I mean, all in, right? And that's where somebody's, they're driving out to the pucker brush and they've got 40 stops and, 300 miles on average. And we've done some of those, right? And those are probably appropriate charges for the expenses. And I've done the opposite where it's very, very dense, right? So when I normally what I'll want to do is when I'll look at a P&L and I can tell pretty quickly what's kind of out of kilter, if you will. So one of the first things I look at is wages as a percent of revenue. And one would say, well, you want to keep wages at or below 50% before payroll taxes. And that's probably a good place to start, but it could be significantly lower than that if you have a very rural ISP. And the reason why is because in your ISP charges, so much more is allocated to repairs, maintenance, and fuel, and it could be a lot higher than that if you look in a very compressed, or we'll call it urban CSA, where you're right next to the terminal. So you have to take all things into consideration, but you want to look there and say, okay, are you at or below 50? If you're below 50, is it rural, and is that appropriate, and is it good? And if you're above 50, are you urban or average kind of a deal? So a long story short is, most people, more than half, are probably higher from a payroll perspective than they should be. And part of that is that it's generally because you'll get a dispatch at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, depending on the terminal, some later than that. And you'll get people that are getting paid on a daily basis, and they're coming back to the terminal at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And what we do is we allow that to happen for a long period of time. Before you know it, you're spending too much in payroll. And that's where that happens. Another thing I like to look at is repairs and maintenance as a percentage of revenue, right? So before even looking at Schedule B and what the age of the fleet is, if I'm seeing somebody that's like north of 9, 10, or 11% of repairs and maintenance as a part of revenue, it's like, whoa, that fleet must be old. Holy smokes, right? Now, when I first bought my first ISP, without knowing what I was doing, I went in there and bought that ISP, and I bought a bunch of old trucks with it. And that was what it was. And I found out really quickly, I had a bunch of deferred maintenance, because that thing got sold. And long story short is, over the next 3 to 5 years, I replaced all of my vehicles with new trucks. And I did that strategically. One, I wanted to get out of diesel. Two, I had pretty condensed routes, and I knew that I was going to keep these trucks for a long time. But I got out of this really high burn of repairs and maintenance, which old diesel trucks can do that to you, right? So I got that. Now my repairs and maintenance is about 2.4% of my revenue, but I was, 11, 12, 13%. It was just, burning me up. So in a way, you're kind of trading repairs and maintenance for buying vehicles. But then you're going to get some reliability out of that. And then you're also going to get a balance sheet, that's going to support, your business at some point in time. If you ever sell it, is going to help the valuation of it. So there's lots of things. You got to have a strategy around that. But those are the areas that would step out, or, that would I would say would pop out at you, which would be payroll, repairs and maintenance. And then I would also look at insurance, right? So I think Marsh is pretty competitive on the auto, on the truck liability stuff, but they're not competitive whatsoever around workers' compensation. And I think what people need to understand is, and I think a lot of the legacy operators have mismanaged their workers' compensation, and workers' compensation is like the most expensive insurance we can buy. In fact, it can range from 4% of payroll to 15% of payroll, depending on how you manage the losses and what gets tagged, if you will, as a result of an injury. So this is why you got to be really careful about who you hire, keeping people, and probably not hiring really old, fragile people, because they're going to turn in some huge workers' comp. Like, for example, I'm 61 years old. You don't want to hire me to go deliver packages because I'm really healthy. But I'm just saying, I probably statistically or from an actuarial perspective have a much higher rate of turning in a workers' compensation than somebody that's 25 and just ran track for the University of Oregon. Right. So my thing is when, and I've seen literally CSAs die or not be sold because their workers' compensation has been mismanaged and it destroyed their P&L. So that's something, I don't think anybody talks about, but you should shop that. Now, obviously, if you don't have very good loss experience, you're probably not going to get very good rates, but I would never buy workers' compensation insurance from like Marsh Protective unless your mod rate is well over 1 and you've got nowhere else to go. So those are the 3 buckets. Now I could deep dive into other ones, but I would say when I scan that really quickly, it's like I'm going to know where to go, and start that consultative conversation and helping people kind of get their P&L back in order, if you will.
So to recap, for my own clarity, kind of the top 3 things. One would be payroll. Second might be repair and maintenance, and then workman's comp.
And workman's comp. Yeah, workers' compensation insurance is probably in a light item of insurance. A lot of the when you look at these income statements, they bundle it with truck insurance, and it's important to kind of ask the question or get into the general ledger and say, well, how much of that is actually workers' comp, right? And even if you will. So when we broker routes, for example, we're going to ask for a copy of the workers' compensation policy and get what their mod rate is. And that's really important, especially for a buyer. And I've actually had a couple of deals over the last couple of years get completely, trashed because the workers' compensation rate was so bad. And where you had, hundreds of thousands of dollars in claims, and they were almost uninsurable.
So I want to be mindful of our time. We've been talking about improving cash flow. The other 2 topics that we wanted to talk about today are negotiations and then some strategies around the alternative vehicle program. So Steve, you have SMR Capital, and then you also have FXG Contractor University. Right. So you have experience doing this. You had mentioned already that all 21 negotiators within FedEx. You've done this many, many times. So you obviously have lots that you could talk about here. But just, I guess, to start at a high level, when someone goes into negotiations, what are some of the things that they should be thinking about?
Well, so if we remember how the FedEx process these days is they want to give you they want to shortcut the process because they've got a lot of negotiations to do. So they've come up with this plan in the last couple of years. It's called Mezzo 1, Mezzo 2, Mezzo 3. In fact, I'm not sure exactly what Mezzo is an acronym for, but basically I would call it door number 1, 2, or 3. All of them have the same contract value. They just come with a different variable structure. So it's super important to understand going in how to normalize a set of ISP charges against your prior ISP charges. I think what happens with a lot of contractors is like, oh, my revenue's, X and it used to be Y, right? And it's like, well, you forget about the revenue because it's just a forecast. And we all know that last year, this time, they were still forecasting, a 5% increase in ground and 9% in e-commerce. And guess what? That didn't happen. In fact, it went the other way around. So it's not about forecasting revenue. And revenue is not what keeps us alive as contractors. It's profitability. And profitability is equal to revenues minus expenses. And that's why I always focus on expenses. But more importantly is which way are your rates trending? In other words, I always say P times Q is equal to R. Price, which is your charges, times Q, the quantity, production is equal to R, revenues. But then your profitability is a function of, we'll call it revenue minus expenses. And so that's really, really important. So what we do is, and I built a tool for this, is you take the old ISP charges, the new ISP charges, you take that PCAT data, which is that proposal capture analytical tool data. You look at their forecast, which may not come true, but right now the forecasts are coming in with a slight decline, about 4% in e-commerce and about 2.5% in non-e-commerce. And then what you have to do is you have to normalize the charges for the fuel index. There's a strike price on fuel before, and there's a strike price on the new, and then look at that and say, are my rates going down or up? And unfortunately, they're pretty flat right now. In some cases, I've seen a minus 1.3%. Southern California, they're getting pretty good rates. Out of the box, you're getting 4, 5, 6% in some cases, right? And so you need to figure that out, because if your rates are going down in an inflationary market, you have this thing called margin compression. And if you have margin compression, no matter how efficient you actually are, you're actually going to get run out of business over a period of time. So you're going to fight for charges increasing relative to what you had last time, regardless of the production. That's really important to understand. The next thing is you need to understand is, where is your current actual production related? Where is it in relation to what they're forecasting it's going to be? So what we'll do is we'll look at the forecast. They're going to tell you, they're going to take the 12-month historical data. We're going to do a look back at that. Then they're going to tell you what we think you're going to be delivering 12 months from now. And that, in this case, in the last 6 months, it's less, not. And then what I always do is go back to your charge statements. Let's go look at the last 6 to 8 weeks of actual production data and compare it to the forecasted annual. And if you're forecasting less than, if your actual is less than their forecast, you must move to a much lower variable, or what I call highest fixed. And I can get people down into a 56% variable, versus maybe last year they were at 75 because the forecast was for growth. And that's super protective in a very down market. So most of my clients were doing that right now. In some cases, in some micro markets, they're outproducing the forecast and will go with a higher variable. So I would say that right now is, for the first time in 7 years that I've been doing negotiations, we're actually negotiating, and we're not doing it through Mezzo 1, 2, or 3. We're 100% of the time going traditional, making sure that we move that variable down to a much lower rate of 56, 57, 58% variable, and the remaining being fixed, and making sure we have the right money in the right buckets, which is fuel and package charges and things of that nature. And since I do so many of these, we go traditional 100% of the time. And there is, generally speaking, and I'm going to say this out loud, is that there's about a 0.5% kind of in their back pocket that they can cough up. And I normally get that 80, 85% of the time, right? So there is money there. There's maybe, and without going to impasse, right? And we all know that, once you declare and go to impasse, that's a very high risk situation where you're basically saying, I'm come to impasse with FedEx. and I'm not, and you're going to put your CSA at risk. Now, we've done a lot of impasse work. You really don't only want to go down that path if you have a tremendous amount of leverage, and that would be a pre-peak end of agreement timeline, or when your stand-up date is within a couple weeks of contract ending. That doesn't happen very often, but it does. And or if there's a lot of other failure that happens to be in that terminal. Now, this last fourth quarter, I did about 62 negotiations, 13 of the 62. We went to end of agreement, that were end of agreement, pre-peak. We took FedEx to the cleaners, and rightfully so, because we had the leverage, and it's all about the leverage. So, on the low end, we negotiated a deal for about $35,000 more a year. And on the super high end, once somebody out of a Durham, we did a deal for about $449,000 more a year on a baseline contract of about $1.7 million. So we really, and obviously they don't, we had their backup, and they were not happy about all that, but it was like that, or we're just going to let everything sit in the terminal. So, and it may be because of that we're end up in the metals program under this new kind of program where they're stringing out now negotiations over 6 months, and they're trying now to keep us from going to impasse. But there are tricks, maybe not tricks. There is a methodology to getting more money and better structure out of FedEx. And especially with open CSAs that I've been negotiating, I've been able to negotiate 20 to 25%, generally more in total ISP charges on open CSAs than just end of agreement. And the reason for that is because they are open, and there's a bunch of contingency fees that are being paid, and they want to stop that bleeding. So I can tell you a lot more stories about all that, but there's a method to the madness. We built tools, obviously, to do that. I can negotiate directly with FedEx on your behalf because I do have a title of negotiator in the system. But I think the most educational way to do the negotiation is a very collaborative session with the AO and the negotiator, ends up with the best results.
Okay. Anything else on negotiations? I feel like that was good stuff to get the gears turning for people. And, obviously this is a relatively short form product that we're putting out, so we're not going to be super in depth, but getting the gears turning and those few ideas you put out, I think are going to be really helpful for people. Anything else on the topic of negotiations?
No, I'll keep it. I can deep dive it later if we need to do that.
And then the last thing on the list for today was you wanted to talk about leveraging the alternative vehicle program. And correct me if I'm wrong, this is something that was relatively new. I think that FedEx rolled it out during the pandemic. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I think so. It feels like it's been 3.5 years when they first rolled out the AVP program, otherwise known as the alternative vehicle program. And that's I'll just characterize that as a kind of an Uber, Lyft type of program, which is, I would call it BYOV, bring your own vehicle. There's obviously a way, to bring those candidates into the system. They still have to be W-2 employees, but you can literally recruit these people, which I've been involved in that program since day one. And it's been very experimental. In fact, I think we have probably the highest AVPs in the Pacific Northwest. But essentially what that is that saying, I'm going to deliver packages, and they're going to be small packages, in somebody else's vehicle. And they're going to show up, and you're going to put, anywhere from 30 packages to 100, depending on the size of the packages. And they're going to make those deliveries. And where the economics really come out astonishingly well is that you're not having to spend a bunch of CapEx to go buy new vehicles. You're not having to do vetter. You're not having to do backup cameras. You're not having to do a drug test. You're not having to do L20 training. I mean, all of these things that you have to do to get people in that program. Now, I got to tell you, I started with what I would call the BYOV, bring your own vehicle program. I did that for about 3.5 years, a couple of peaks. Didn't have to actually rent any vehicles during peak because that can be a big miss in terms of your financials. But then about 4 months ago, I decided to do something radically different that's actually within guideline for the FedEx AVP program. And that is what I call, I just coined this term. I did AVP on steroids. And what that is that I decided to go out and buy my own AVP vehicles. And those are 7-passenger vans. And instead of recruiting somebody with their car, and then having to go out and figure out, is that vehicle, titled to them? Do they have the right insurance? Is that car, people would show up with a very small car, like a Prius. And it's like, well, how many stops can you do there? So what I decided to do is standardize that process. So I went out and bought 7 Toyota Siennas that have 150,000 miles on them. And those are very reliable vehicles. And I paid about $12,000 each for it. In fact, I used some ERTC money to go do that. And then, obviously put them in the program and put them on my Marsh policy for $10 a week. And now, hire people into my organization, as an AVP candidate, or actually as an AVP driver. You can literally do a background check and get them, in the system within a couple hours. Within a couple days, they're going to have scanner training, and you're going to really find out what they're all about. And I pay them $25 a day and $1 a stop, and I can get them 150 stops, and they can do in 6 to 7 hours in my CSA. Now, that works really well for me. So I've been able to play that card in this, super high inflationary environment and get my cost to delivery in my AVP program down to about $1.30, $1.35 a stop, and that be very predictable, very bulletproofish in turn, because I've got my own vehicles and from a compliance and all that. So that's working well for me. But more importantly is I'm bringing everybody, all my new drivers, in through the AVP program. And if they do really well at that in a couple, 2-3 months, well, then we will promote them to an L20. And now I'm saving on my training cost because I've had a good look-see, in the AVP program for a couple of months. So I'm finding that I'm reaping multiple benefits by bringing people in that door, which is a lower cost of delivery. And obviously, kind of ramping them up through an L20 and sometimes into a straight truck. And then from there into management, if there's an opening. So, and it allows me to be much more flexible, in terms of, flexing my fleet with, in this, I would say in a very interesting, environment that's a lot lower volume than I expected. It also allows you to, if you need to and want to, do contingencies in other terminals and have people go up there in those vehicles. I haven't done it, but I've talked to some people that have done that kind of work and can do it more cost effective.
So beyond the AVP program, give us a quick rundown. What's the vehicle mix that you have in your 2 CSAs? Straight trucks, step vans, panel vans?
Yeah. So in my CSA, it is I'm pretty close to the terminal. I mean, up until I did this AVP program on steroids where I bought the vehicles, 100% of my vehicles were step vans, and primarily P1000s, P1200s. When we did the overlap, what I did was buy the largest possible, the biggest truck, right, I possibly can, which I bought. I've got, 4 or 5 P1200s that I bought, and just jam as much stuff in there as possible. And, and really it's all about, reducing the number of dispatch. So I've done that, but, lately what I've done is I've been able to actually deduplicate or eliminate, 2 to 3 of these larger step vans that go out by shifting a lot of small and medium stuff to these AVP vehicles. So I dispatch between 3 and 4 and sometimes 5 AVP vehicles a day, depending on the volume, and then not send out maybe 3 step vans they get 6 miles a gallon. In those Toyota Siennas, I'm getting 18 to 20 miles a gallon, and they can go down, residential areas that I couldn't get a P1000 or P1200. So it's giving me more flexibility, but but I would say I've always been a step van guy up until this kind of a hybrid model I've got together now with AVP. And I've got one straight truck in each one of my CSAs, one in Salem, Oregon, one in Portland. And so I'm not driving a lot of miles. I do have a few stem miles in Portland, but once I get out to my contracted service area, it's fairly dense. And I would say that 30% of my business in terms of volume is probably ground, and the remaining is going to be residential or home delivery. I guess it would be e-commerce is what they call it.
So do you feel like there's an opportunity to take what you're doing with the AVP program and expand it? I mean, are you going to add more Toyota Siennas to your fleet?
So I bought 7 of them, and I've got in 2 CSAs. I'm going to expand it probably more north into my Portland CSA. But you can't replace your fleet with it because of you got a large package or the incompatibles. I mean, there's just some routes that it's not practical for, but we've been able to go into DRO. We've been able to skim off the smalls. I think with Express coming, and I'm assuming that they're going to pay us at the lower e-commerce rate if they give us a lot of volume, which is, I think they're going to do, because that's one of the corporate priorities is to deduplicate the expenses of FedEx Express into the ground network where there is a common zip code. So I'm prepared. I can make a ton of money probably if they give me a lot of volume and run that through the AVP program versus put it on a truck. Now, the backlash to that is I've got some older drivers, so not older drivers, but we'll call it legacy drivers. They've been with me for 4 or 5 years. They're like, hey man, you took all of my smalls from me. And now I've become, a large package, kind of a truck. And I'm like, well, that's kind of, the world changes. But let me remind you that, you get paid a little more money, and they've got some employee benefits and 401k. And so you have to have some of those, conversations to get their head back in the game. But that is what's going to happen is you're going to move some really easy stuff off we'll call it the legacy L20 drivers and into the AVP world. But I believe if you don't play every economic card like that, that is going to be very difficult in this recession, if you will, with FedEx, because they're just not giving us extra money in our negotiations on average to offset the inflationary pressures of running the business.
You had mentioned Express, and that FedEx Corporation as a whole is under a lot of pressure right now to increase profitability, become more efficient. That's one of the things that we've read about in the news is, you'll have an Express facility just down the road from a ground facility. It's like, why do we have 2 buildings? We could have 1 building like UPS does, for example. Do we have any idea what the path looks like for diverting Express volume to ground? Is there any kind of a timeline that?
I don't know the time. What I do know is about 3 years ago, their corporate headquarters did I think a McKinsey study or somebody with one of the big consulting companies, maybe it was Bain. And through that, there was a target identified of deduplicating $5 billion in annual expenses by effectively moving a good portion of the volume out of Express. We'll call it the non-time sensitive, like, late afternoon or maybe second day kind of air into the ground network because it's so much cheaper. So there was a bogey that was put out there a few years ago. From an execution perspective, I just haven't seen that or heard of an update. And I don't believe these P&D managers or senior managers are privy to any of that corporate strategy whatsoever. They're just being stacked, ranked every day on inbound service and safety and probably whatever the flavor of the month is for these codes and stuff like that. So, you might be able to hear some of that stuff from the shareholders, from the quarterly meetings with investors, but not, I've not really heard anything very specific to timeline that's accurate at all.
Got it. Steve, is there anything else that you want to cover today? And I know you and I had talked about kind of breaking this up into 3 separate parts. So we've got plenty more that we can talk about on future episodes. Anything else you want to cover today?
No, I think we've talked about a lot, and I think, if this goes well and we get some, good feedback, we can there's lots more to cover in future podcasts. But I'm hoping that this topic is relevant to most of the contractors, and that they've been able to, think about their business at least a little differently on a go forward. But I'd just encourage everybody to probably step back. I'll go back to halt. If you're getting really worn out and tired, step back a little bit, reassess your business, examine your personal priorities and then kind of re-engage with your business and make better business decisions. But you got to be in the right frame of mind. And if you don't know, if you have a weakness or an opportunity to improve your business and you don't have that acumen, that skill, or, there's advisors out there. There's people out there you can get a hold of, that can be your mentor, I guess, or consultant, if you will, in different aspects of your business. So I think there's Route Consultant out there. I know that he doesn't have his core business anymore, but he's got some good business. There's eTruck Biz. I think that's eTruck Biz. There's, people like yourself. AP Financial does a fantastic job around educating people on the right truck, on the right route to do the right thing. I learned a lot from you guys when I first got in the business on, gas versus diesel and what to do. But there's a lot, and fellow contractors. There's a guy who's been in the business for a long time. They're super smart, right? So I just say forge healthy relationships, ask great questions, stay positive, and just remember that this last mile delivery space is forever. People are going to continue to buy stuff online, and they need it shipped to their house. So I'd stay encouraged and smile and take one day at a time.
Steve, where can people find you and information for your various companies?
I would say that the best way to get a hold of us is just, on the web. www.smrcapital.com is the best way. You can kind of read about our value proposition, kind of what we do. We are existing contractors, and there's a phone number there. There's a contact, a form. That's probably the easiest way to get a hold of us. And I'll be happy to chat with you about the business model.
Well, thanks for coming on, Steve.
Well, thanks for having me, Ryan. I really appreciate your time today, and I apologize if I got too verbose on some of these subjects.
No, that was perfect. Routing for Success is brought to you by AP Equipment Financing. In today's competitive market, it is essential to acquire the right trucks at a fair price and finance them in a way that makes sense for your business. Leveraging their extensive network of truck and van suppliers, the experts at AP Equipment Financing will help you locate the best deals on step vans, cutaways, panel vans, and more. Deliver them straight to your facility and finance them with low monthly installment options. Click the link in the description or visit apfinancing.com for more information. Routing for Success is an independent production of AP Equipment Financing and is in no way affiliated with or endorsed by FedEx Corporation, FedEx Ground, Amazon, or any other logistics company discussed herein. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Routing for Success.